I'm just going to use the regular Ableton saturator for this. Anyway, I love the saturator on Ableton. It's so good. I use it for all sorts of stuff. I use it for vocals sometimes. I use it for percussion. I use it for entire drum buses. I love using it for synths. It does the work really well. I'm gonna just a bit warmer. Turn this up. I'm going to delete those last two. And swing. Right. So when it comes to drums, so that's essentially how I would start making a two-step beat. I mean, obviously there's all sorts of two-step beats you can make. You could do something a bit more funky, like these. Like that. I'm going to duplicate this kick, or not duplicate it, but use the same kick as I did in the by the end of this, by the way, I'll have consolidated everything, so I won't be having duplicates of kicks, etc. They will be consolidated. But let me just put this in here. Put a little water filter. I'm going to take out the low end. When it comes to percussion, etc., you want to be a bit more sparse when you're using sharp, spaced out drums like this. It's what works for me anyway. I mean, obviously do what you like, but I'm gonna make sure swings on here. Gonna pull this up again. Once again, work with the velocity. That sounds pretty cool. So what I've done here is just play around with the velocities again to just make the accents pop out a little bit. Let's see what the percussion sounds like. remove these two here. I think that sounds pretty cool. And here we have a little open hi-hat that I'm gonna just turn that down a little bit. Turn the glue up a little bit. What the glue essentially does is it makes the volume of the hi-hat more even throughout. It's just basic compression. Sounds a bit easy on the ears when you're making music like this, I think. I'm gonna take those low that again here as well. See what we've got here. It's the same stuff as earlier. Some pretty cool sounding stuff. So let me just make a separate audio here. What can I use? Type in the beer here. I'm gonna cut this bit off here. And then I reckon I'm gonna reverse the sample just at the end of the loop here. And see what it sounds like. It's a bit too long, but let's just use the fade here on the track. Might not use it as often, but let's just make it a little bit shorter. Not bad, I think. Let's see what else we've got here. Again, you might see me taking out stuff tomorrow. It just totally depends on where we go melodically with all the other elements, because as we go on, we'll sort of start to understand the relationship that individual percussion has with the harmonics of it, also the melodic elements of the track and the bass line, etc. Because what separates sort of good UK garage from really good UK garage is being able to sort of have all those elements work together really, really well without it sounding too messy. People like Prescribe the Vibe are amazing at building two-step garage like that. I'll talk more about sort of processing as the week goes on. But this is sort of how I would lay drums down, just really, really quickly, if I wanted to put an idea down. I'll talk a lot about EQing and compression and stuff like that, saturation and all that. But for now, this is how I would go about making a two-step beat or a 4x4 beat. So yeah, if anyone has any questions to ask, I'm here to answer them. Let me just look at the chat. Awesome.
Yeah, I've got a quick one, if that's all
Yeah,
right.
man. Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
so yeah, I was just wondering, my Zoom cut out for a little bit, so I might have just missed something.
Yeah.
But how did you get like the sort of like the glue and all of that inside the drum rack?
So that is specifically, so when you have an ADG file here, um, that, so example, that's just the automatic thing that Ableton gives you essentially when you load in um, a core kit, for example. Oh, wrong one. It's the wrong one. Just the individual clap itself. That's sort of what it gives you. I'm not actually sure whether that's something you can do yourself, the samples that you load into Ableton yourself, but this is a pretty good rack that Ableton provides for drum samples. I reckon you'd be able to swap out. I'm not actually sure whether maybe someone who's here. Yeah, someone just said you can save default loading racks. So I reckon if you just save this rack as a default rack, you'd be able to just load any sample into it in the use
S-
library.
Sweet, nice one, man.
No worries. Yeah. So let me just read the chat. Why did you switch to Ableton from FL? So I started in FL just because it was sort of the easiest thing to get my hands on back at the time, and really enjoyed making music in it. Everything that I made up until about 2016, and that includes the My Heart EP, was made on FL Studio. But that was the year I started touring with my live band. So I toured before that, but as a DJ. But I eventually started touring with a live band. I had a drummer who played sort of MIDI instruments and acoustic drums, and then I had a guy who played keys and bass. And we all had loads of MIDI instruments, and we reckoned the best way to control all of that would be through Ableton. So I learned Ableton essentially so I could have a live show. But then I really enjoyed producing on it as well because I just thought the sort of intuitive feel that it has and the fact that you sort of automate stuff with your hands on the keyboard and on the mouse, etc. I thought that was really cool. And the way you can manipulate audio as well, I think, as far as I know, I might be wrong, is unmatched. I mean, I know Logic is really good for recording, etc. But um, yeah, that's kind of why I switched, just because it's my live show. Do you put the same swing on every clip in the session, or do you ever use different swings on different? So I'll always use the same swing template, just because it will sound disjointed and sloppy if I didn't. So that goes for kicks, that goes for snares, that goes for percussion, it goes for bass, it goes for sample chops, it goes for vocal chops, anything. There's even been times where I've done a remix for an artist and the way they've sung a track in certain bits when they've sang like 16th notes, they haven't made sense with the groove of the track. So I've had to go in and actually manually chop bits of the lead vocal, for example, to fit in with the groove. I think that's how important it is to keep sort of uniformity across the whole track. Are you only applying swing to popular and more repetitive rhythmic? So that's are you only applying swing to a couple of the more repetitive rhythmic elements? So they're the most important things, but I'll typically apply swing to anything that has 16th notes, essentially. When you're making the two-step stuff, is the kick usually a little less sluggy and you stick the bass underneath that frequency, or does it depend? It completely depends. If I'm going for a really sparse sounding, really dark UKG track, the kick is going to be a lot lighter, I think, because you want to have the bass do all the heavy lifting. If there is an instance in which I want a bit of a heavier bass, I'll just sidechain the bass to the kick more aggressively. But yeah, I try to keep the really subby kicks for 4/4 stuff because that's usually when I'm going for high energy. By the way, if something I'm explaining isn't clear, just feel free to ask again because I know I can get a bit muddled with my words. Um, Once you have all the syncopated parts lined up, do you put them all in a space using, say, one room reverb send or treat reverb individually depending on the element? Again, I think that's really dependent on what I'm doing. I do actually have a send here, but I've never been the kind of person to use like sends a lot. It's only something I recently started doing, and I'm still kind of like learning what works for me. Um, there are instances in which I'll just send everything to the same reverb just for uniformity, but there are times in which it sounds cool. Like when I make UKG, I'm not trying to make it sound natural because it's not the point. Um, so the weirdness that you can get from using different types of reverb, I think that really sort of helps. I don't know. I think it does sound cool. But again, it is really, really dependent on what you're depending on what you're kind of trying to go for.
Hey, I have a question if that's cool.
Yeah, man, go ahead.
I was wondering, like, how you started the session, you had your sounds like all loaded up. Do you usually if you're working on something by yourself when you start, do you have sounds loaded up or do you just go from whatever you hear in your head or whatever?
So I specifically set this session up just because Nick warned me at the start that you wouldn't be able to hear my sort of preview here on the left hand side. I never have my stuff like set up. I always start from total scratch. Just because I don't know, I know it sounds like it should be easier for me to just have everything laid out, and I think that's what works for a lot of people. But I think if I did that, I'd risk um, my drums sounding too similar in every track, and because of the nature of the music I make already, um, that tends to be the case. So I don't want to push that even further. So if I just make drums from scratch completely, it means that I'll be picking different samples every time that can kind of drastically change the feel of the track, which is kind of what I'm going for. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, man, that did. Thanks.
Awesome. How did moving to the UK affect the music you make and or listen to? Do you think being the home of UKG influenced or helped you develop your style? Yeah, so I've lived in the UK for 7 years. I grew up in Austria in Vienna. That city has no UKG scene at all. So my exposure to UKG was just on the internet essentially. I think it definitely it definitely helped not being around UKG for the first part of my uh, sort of music making career. I mean, I wasn't making UKG back then, but a lot of the music I was making was sort of very UK influenced. I'm talking sort of 2012, 2013, post dubstep, James Blake, Subtract, Mount Kimby era. I was making bits of that kind of stuff. And I think the fact that I wasn't in the middle of all that, like none of my friends listened to that stuff. Um, I barely knew anyone who was into that kind of music. So I wasn't surrounded by it as much, which meant that my take on it was naturally going to be a little more influenced by the stuff I was listening to at the time, which was um, like R&B and hip hop. Essentially, like even now, I mean, anyone who's listened to the music, you'll hear the effect or the sort of influence that soul, R&B, and hip hop have in my music. But then moving to the UK and especially because I moved to the UK when I was 18 and I was able to then go to clubs, it drastically changed the way I started making music. I know my music is a lot of it's very sort of maximalist, especially the newer stuff like Want You There, and some of my forthcoming releases are very sort of over the top. But I've learned to rein it in production wise, just because once you start listening to UKG in a club, you realize that often less is more, and that doesn't necessarily mean that um, you know a track can't be really loud and crazy. It just means that, you know, layering a track with more and more and more and more individual elements doesn't necessarily make a track better. In fact, it can really detract from the end product. But you know, this goes not just for UKG. This goes for a lot of music, pop music as well, rap as well, R&B as well. But yeah, I think definitely being here and sort of being able to be immersed in UK garage cultures definitely had a huge impact on how I produce. So yeah, any more questions? Do you listen to the genres you like to make or avoid it and listen to other stuff? That's a good question. I reckon about 70% of the music that I listen to, I mean, obviously it comes and goes in waves, but 70% of the music I listen to is not electronic or not electronic dance music. I listen to a lot of rap. I listen to a lot of R&B. I love like rock music, like psych rock. I love soul, funk, jazz. That's where a lot of my influences come from. 80s soul. 80s soul is great because that's the kind of music I tend to sample as well in my stuff. And I think not spending too much time listening to the music that you make is healthy for your production, I reckon, because the more you get into garage and the more you listen to garage, the more you will subconsciously start trying to mimic what you hear. And that can be a good thing, but it can also mean that you put a stepping stone in your own path, just because it means you end up sounding like a lot of other people, which doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. But if you're looking for a fresh take on, or if you're looking to have a fresh take on UK garage, then I highly advise just not listening to UK garage. I love UK garage, but if I spent too much time listening to it, I don't know whether that'd be very good for me. But I still spend a lot of time listening to it. But I try to, the less time I spend listening to it, the better I feel my music becomes, the more unique my takes on it become. How do you figure out ways to get inspired by the different genres? Like, if you can give an example of maybe some way they influence you and your ideas. So, for example, I love listening to French house, like Daft Punk, Fred Falke, Alan Braxe, stuff like that. The way they sample 70s funk or 80s soul. And while my music is not French house, you can kind of hear the influence. The way, for example, in my last track, Want You There, the way that sample repeats itself, that's a really repetitive loop. That's, for me, that's sort of one of the trademarks of French house. It's taking one of the hookiest parts of a song and just looping it to death in a really over-exaggerated way. That, for example, is signature French house to me. Like, I'm not talking about the calmer stuff. I'm talking about the really, really high energy stuff, like Superheroes by Daft Punk, stuff like that. But when it comes to R&B, chords, and I'm not just talking in 2000s and 90s R&B. Most of the R&B I listen to is actually from the 80s. There's some absolutely incredible stuff out there to listen to. It can tend to be a little bit cheesy, but cheese is one thing I really love, and I think if you can pull it off really nicely, that's a good thing. Because back then, like 70s and 80s, the way people wrote pop music was a lot that, especially the more happy stuff, it's a lot more sort of in your face and a lot more sort of melodic information, but they managed to do it in a way that makes sense. And a lot of the tracks I work on, they sound very busy and very over the top. But if you can get that to make sense, then that's a good thing. And that's kind of one of my takeaways from 80s soul, 80s R&B. Yeah, anyone else? What do you do for samples? YouTube. YouTube. I follow a few channels that just upload stuff from the sort of eras, the 70s and the 80s. And it helps that it's music I love listening to as well. Spotify is really, really great too. I have playlists of hundreds of songs that I just put on during the day. Oh, sorry, Carl, I missed your question. But yeah, so YouTube and Spotify are two really good places to check samples. Sorry, Carl, I didn't see your question there. Do you always start your tracks by building drums and percussion like today? Or do you sometimes build your track from something else like samples, melodies, or vocals and build your drums around them? I never start my tracks with my drums at all. I did this purely for just so I can, as an introduction to UKG. But usually I'll start my track with a sample or with some chords or with any sort of melodic information rather than the drums. I think the drums, I don't want to say drums are secondary because they're obviously very important, but to me, the melodic elements of a track are more important than the percussive elements of a track. And once I've nailed sort of an 8-bar loop, I can go ahead from there and build some drums. Obviously, sometimes I start sessions where I have a very specific drum pattern in my head that I want to get down, and I'll do that. But I'd say a good 90% of the time, it's vocals, samples, melodies, chords. Do you have a routine in the day, like produce for 2 hours no matter what, or just if you're feeling it? And how many hours do you usually produce for? This is a good question. I've tried it a few couple of ways. So a few years ago, I'd get up every day at sort of 8:30, 9 o'clock, like it was just a regular job, and just sit down and work till 4, 5, whatever. Take a break. I mean, also take a break at lunch and then take a break after and maybe come back to it in the evening. But and this is me speaking out of a very privileged position because I can obviously, I mean, I get up and I'm able to work sort of when I want, but I tend not to force it if I haven't got an idea that's in my head. Sometimes an idea will come to me if I go sample digging or if I go through my folder of songs I bought to sample. But usually I won't if there's nothing, if I don't feel creative, I don't feel the need to sit down. And usually if I'm not feeling creative, there's nothing good that's going to come out of my head. So but sometimes I'll go a whole day without making anything, and then at 11 p.m. I'll pick up my laptop because I've had a great idea. But the thing with production is that, just do it as it comes. You won't get anything out of forcing yourself to. I know there's a lot of people who are like, stay on your grind 24/7, but it's just nonsense in my opinion. Like, unless you're some sort of really, really highly trained musician or someone who comes with ideas constantly, I'd avoid that, especially if you don't want to burn yourself out. Because I did that for a couple of months last year during the start of the pandemic. I was like, yes, this is my chance to make 1 million songs. And then I'd sit down every day and I was really, really productive for a bit, but it got to October and I couldn't make music for 4 months. I just had to stop completely because I'd just totally burned myself out. When you make music, you are putting a part of your mind, as cheesy as this sounds, you are putting a part of your mind into a computer. And it is energy that you're spending, whether it's mental or physical energy, it is energy that you're spending. So treat it with respect, and that will make it a lot easier for you. Yeah, let me know if you want me to elaborate on anything, by the way. Anything within the drum project, I'm happy to answer. What are some of your clubs or parties that really turned you onto the sound? Good idea. Good question. Sorry. So I lived in Brighton for 2 years, and I'm trying to think of the names of the parties that I went to originally. It wasn't actually Grime Nights that sorry, it wasn't actually Garage Nights that put me onto the sound. It was Grime Nights. Because I grew up in Austria, garage and grime weren't available to me in clubs. So when I moved to UK and I started going to grime nights, grime DJs often play garage in their tunes, more like old school dark garage for MCs to MC over, and that's kind of what rekindled that love for me, and one of the things that made me kind of start wanting to make UKG. I see you barely used any EQ or processing. Is that for the purpose of this video, or do you wait till you get a solid groove down before you process things? So because the way I process my drums is sort of reliant on the rest of the tune, so let's say the samples, etc., I usually won't start EQing my drums until I've got both my melodic elements and my drums down. Just because if I start EQing my tracks a certain way, my drums a certain way, I don't know, it just might sound weird later on. I do mix as I go, but in order, just for me to get a simple drum loop down, I won't EQ anything unless there's any really harsh frequencies I need EQing out. For example, I mean, the only thing I did here, so I put a high pass filter on this kick here. But apart from that, not usually until later. Whereas with melodic elements, any VSTs or any samples, I will usually EQ straight away and usually add some reverb straight away. Any favorite newer up and coming UKG artists? Yeah, there's loads. I mean, I want to be careful with who I call up and coming here, because I mean, I feel like this new generation of sort of UKG artists, I mean, I sort of consider myself part of that sort of generation of producers, but just UKG producers that I like that are sort of new-ish are MPH. MPH is an absolutely just ridiculous producer. He releases stuff with Nightbase, I think. Then Jemmy is just one of my favorites. He has this really slick, futuristic take on garage, which I love. Opidan, she's amazing. Has also released on Nightbase, I think. Really, really great producer. Higo is just his last tune with what's her name? Poppy Bascom. That track is amazing. Oh, Interplanetary Criminal. He's a producer from Manchester, where I live myself. His stuff leans sort of more towards sort of breaky, really dark stuff. Ridiculous. That's what I listen to when I want to listen to some really, really dark UKG. Oh yeah, Cryptogram is great as well. Do you ever add top loops to your drum patterns, or do you always make them on MIDI? I mean, there have been instances where I use loops. I do use loops all the time. It just totally depends what I'm going for, because sometimes my only issue with loops is, and sometimes you can sort of remedy this, but sometimes loops that I use haven't got the same sort of groove as the drums that I'm using. And although you can manipulate loops to have the same swing pattern, it doesn't always work perfectly. So just for the sake of being more in control of my drum loops, I prefer to use MIDI, although if there is a top loop that works really well, I'll use that, no problem. It makes my life a lot easier. Can you talk about building structure and extended versus radio edit mixes at some point this week? Absolutely. I think I'm going to touch on that towards the end, just because I know this is something that some people struggle with, and up until recently, really, I still kind of hate making radio edits because it just feels like you're sucking the life out of a track. But it is a necessary evil, and I'll be talking a little bit on how I personally attack it. There are sort of different ways you can go about it. Arrangement and structure is what I really struggle with a lot. You and me both. I mean, Want You There, my latest track. I started the tune that's 2 years ago, and even though Want You There as a song has existed for ages, I've restructured it a million times, which listening to it now, the structure is so simple now, but I was just overcomplicating it so much. Yeah, I'm still learning myself. This is one thing you bear in mind. I'm not an expert. I'm someone who's just banged my head against my computer keyboard hard enough that some of it's kind of stuck. But yeah, I'll definitely go more into depth on arrangement and structure later this week. But yeah, let me know if anyone has any more questions. Any upcoming future collaborations happening soon? Thought Luxury would be a nice combo. Me and Luxury have, I think, 5 songs together, of which 0 are finished. I've gone down to his studio. He lives down south, so I've gone down to visit him a couple of times, and we are very good at starting tracks together, but we're terrible at finishing them. He is coming up here to Manchester in a couple of weeks though, so hopefully we've got some stuff done then. But absolutely, me and Luxury are definitely going to release some tracks at some point. At what point did you know that Want You There was getting somewhere and then ready for release? I think with Want You There is one of those rare cases where I kind of knew from the onset that it was going to be a track that I would like a lot. Just because of how quickly the demo came together. But when the point at which I knew it was ready for release was when basically the biggest issue I had with Want You There was the mixdown. I struggled for a long time with that mixdown, and I'm very, very happy I didn't put that tune any earlier because I'm still getting better at mixing down my songs. If you listen to my music now versus my music 2 years ago, you hear pretty noticeable difference in my opinion anyway. So I'm glad I kind of pushed it to the point where I could play it in a set, just on my decks, into another track, or basically play another track and then fade in my track, and dynamically they would sound sort of alike. I like to A/B my tracks in Ableton, just basically line them up next to each other. Tracks that are sort of in a similar genre. So I'll take a fast-paced 4x4 track with a lot of sort of melodic information, and then A/B it in Ableton, just so I can sort of get a feel for how much more I need to do. I mean, obviously you have to bear in mind the fact that the track you're A/Bing it against will probably be mastered. But if everything sits correctly, if you can tell that everything sort of sits nicely, and that point for me, it took me 2 years. So it was one of those things where I think because I hadn't mixed down a track that sort of loud before, I think I was really struggling because there's so many drum tracks in that tune as well. So it took me a while, but yeah, I reckon it's just a case of pushing it until it sounds good next to other tracks, other very well mixed tracks.